At 65, Leslie Cook stood in the freezing parking lot outside the textile factory she had served for 43 years, clutching a cardboard box that held the last pieces of her old life. Behind the glass doors, younger employees avoided her eyes as security locked the entrance behind her forever. 3 days later, with only $1 left in her bank account, Leslie bought a collapsed abandoned mill deep in rural Pennsylvania, a place the entire town called cursed. But on her first night inside the rotting ruins, as rain hammered through the broken roof, Leslie discovered a strange symbol carved beneath a fallen beam and realized someone had hidden something there long ago, something powerful enough to change everything. If you've ever felt discarded, forgotten, or told your life no longer matters, stay with Leslie's story. Because sometimes, the world throws away the very people capable of rebuilding it. The first time Leslie Cook walked into the Harper textile factory, she had been 22 years old, terrified and wearing shoes with holes hidden beneath folded cardboard inserts. Back then, the factory had still mattered. The machines roared like thunder from dawn until evening. Men unloaded cotton shipments from trucks while women moved carefully between towering, spinning frames coated in white dust. Pittsburgh had smelled like iron smoke and labor. People built entire lives there. Families survived because factories like Harper Textile existed. Leslie remembered gripping her lunch pail so tightly her knuckles turned white on that first morning. She had needed the job desperately after her husband Thomas Cook returned injured from a construction accident that permanently damaged his spine. Overnight, the future they had imagined together disappeared, and Leslie adapted. That was what she had always done. When Thomas became unable to work full-time, Leslie picked up extra shifts. When hospital bills piled higher each month, she stopped buying new clothes. When Rebecca was born, Leslie slept 4 hours a night for years just to keep food on the table. She never complained, not once. Even after Thomas died at 46 from complications related to years of chronic pain medication, Leslie returned to work 3 days after the funeral because missing another paycheck simply was not an option. The factory became her entire identity, and for decades she believed loyalty mattered. Until the morning, everything ended. Leslie still remembered the silence in the conference room. That silence hurt more than the firing itself. Richard Coleman sat across from her in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver watch glinting under fluorescent lights. At 42, he represented everything the new corporate leadership admired: young, polished, ruthless. He folded his hands carefully. "Leslie," he said softly, pretending sympathy, "this restructuring isn't personal." But Leslie knew that was a lie, because years earlier she had shown Richard a method to reduce thread waste during production, a simple adjustment in machine calibration that saved the company thousands every month. Richard had smiled, praised her intelligence, and then presented the idea to executives as his own. That promotion launched his career. Meanwhile, Leslie stayed exactly where she had always been, replaceable. "You gave this company 43 years, Richard continued, "and we appreciate that deeply." Appreciate. The word made Leslie sick. If they appreciated her, why was security standing outside the door waiting to escort her out like a criminal? If they appreciated her, why had younger employees avoided looking at her all morning? If they appreciated her, why did her final severance check barely cover a month's rent? Leslie stared down at her trembling hands. Hands ruined by decades of factory labor. Tiny white scars crossed her fingers from sewing needles and machinery accidents. Arthritis twisted the joints painfully. Her wrists burned constantly now, especially during winter. 43 years. Reduced to a cardboard box and a forced smile. When Leslie finally stood to leave, Richard avoided eye contact. Coward, she thought bitterly. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the parking lot. Workers hurried to their cars, pretending not to notice her standing there, alone beside the building she had practically sacrificed her life to. Only one person stopped. A young woman named Emily from quality control approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Leslie managed a faint smile. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Nothing was all right anymore. 3 weeks later, Leslie sat inside her aging Ford pickup outside a grocery store, staring at her bank account balance on her phone. $1.13. That was all she had left. Her apartment lease had expired. Her severance money vanished faster than she thought possible between rent, medications, utilities, and overdue bills. She had already sold Thomas's old watch, her wedding ring, and nearly everything valuable she owned. She had tried applying for other jobs. Nobody wanted a 65-year-old woman with worn hands and no college degree. We're looking for someone more adaptable. We need fresh energy. You're overqualified. Every rejection sounded polite. Every rejection meant the same thing. Too old. Rebecca called less frequently now. Leslie understood why, even if it hurt. Her daughter lived in Cleveland with her husband and 2 children inside a cramped townhouse drowning in debt. Rebecca worked endless hours at a credit union while her husband Greg bounced between unstable sales jobs. Stress hardened Rebecca over the years. Their conversations always ended the same way. You should move into assisted housing. You can't keep doing this alone. You need to be realistic. Realistic. As if Leslie's existence had become a burden everyone hoped would quietly disappear. That afternoon, Leslie drove west without any destination in mind. Snow-covered roads stretched endlessly through small Pennsylvania towns that looked half forgotten by time itself. Then she saw the sign. County tax auction. Today only. Curious more than hopeful, Leslie pulled into a muddy lot crowded with locals bundled against the cold. Most people were there for farmland parcels or old storage buildings. Near the back, 2 men laughed loudly while staring at a faded property photo attached to a clipboard. The old Whitmore Mill one snorted. That place should have been bulldozed 30 years ago. Whoever buys, it's an idiot. Leslie glanced at the photo. The building looked broken beyond repair. Collapsed roof sections, cracked brick walls, rusted windows, dead trees surrounding it like skeletal fingers. Yet something about it unsettled her, or maybe called to her. The auctioneer barely contained his amusement. Abandoned textile mill outside Bellcrest Township, he announced. Condemned structure. Unsafe access. Property taxes unpaid for 19 years. Nobody bid. Not once. The auctioneer sighed. Minimum bid $1. Silence. Then Leslie heard her own voice. I'll take it. Heads turned instantly. A few people laughed openly. The auctioneer blinked. Ma'am, are you serious? Leslie surprised herself by answering firmly. Yes. 10 minutes later, she walked back to her truck, holding ownership papers for a collapsed abandoned mill she had never seen in person. She should have felt foolish. Instead, for the first time in weeks, she felt something else. Curiosity. Night had already fallen by the time Leslie reached the property. The road leading to the mill was nearly swallowed by weeds and broken branches. Her headlights illuminated enormous shadows stretching across the frozen ground. The building emerged slowly through darkness like the corpse of another century. Massive, broken, silent. Rain began falling as Leslie stepped carefully toward the entrance carrying a flashlight. Inside, the air smelled like wet wood rust and decay. Water dripped steadily through shattered ceiling beams. Ancient machines sat frozen beneath layers of dust and debris. Parts of the floor sagged dangerously under her weight. Most people would have turned around immediately, but Leslie kept walking. Then she saw it. Near the center of the ruined mill, half hidden beneath a fallen support beam, someone had carved a strange symbol into the wood decades earlier. A circle surrounded by weaving thread patterns. Deliberate. Protected. Important. Leslie reached down slowly, brushing dirt away with trembling fingers. And suddenly, deep beneath the storm outside, she felt it. This place was not empty. Someone had hidden something here long ago. And somehow, after losing everything else in her life, Leslie Cook had just found the beginning of something new. Leslie Cook barely slept during her first night inside the abandoned Whitmore Mill. Rainwater leaked steadily through holes in the collapsed roof, tapping against rusted machinery like distant footsteps. Wind howled through shattered windows, carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting wood into the darkness around her. She had parked her pickup truck inside the safest corner she could find near the loading entrance. 2 old blankets covered her shoulders, but the cold still reached her bones. At 3 a.m, Leslie sat upright in the driver's seat, staring at the massive shadows surrounding her. What am I doing here? The question circled endlessly inside her mind. At 65 years old, she owned a condemned building. Nobody wanted. She had no stable income, almost no savings, and no real plan beyond surviving one more day. And yet, for reasons she could not explain, the mill did not feel dead to her. Broken, yes. Forgotten, absolutely. But not dead. As dawn slowly crept through broken windows, Leslie climbed out of the truck, holding a flashlight and an old thermos of coffee she had heated at a gas station miles away. The full size of the building became clearer in daylight. The Whitmore Mill stretched across nearly 3 acres beside a frozen riverbank outside Bellcrest Township. Sections of the upper floors had collapsed inward years earlier, leaving piles of soaked timber and twisted metal exposed to snow and rain. Nature had begun reclaiming everything. Small trees pushed through cracked concrete flooring. Moss spread across brick walls. Birds nested inside rusted conveyor frames hanging dangerously from the ceiling. Most people saw ruin, but Leslie noticed something else. Craftsmanship. Even after decades of neglect, parts of the structure remained remarkably solid. Thick wooden support beams still stood beneath layers of dirt and water stains. Intricate carved railings lined an old staircase near the western wing. Someone had built this place with pride once. Leslie moved carefully through the main production floor, studying old weaving machines frozen beneath blankets of dust. Her fingers brushed across one rusted control panel. "I know you," she whispered softly. The machinery was ancient, but the principles were familiar. Textile production had been her entire life. The rhythm of weaving systems, thread tension controls, spinning sequences. Those things lived inside her memory as naturally as breathing. For the first time since being fired, Leslie did not feel useless. She felt needed. Hours passed while she explored. Near the back storage rooms, she discovered something strange. Unlike the rest of the building, one section appeared intentionally sealed off decades earlier. Thick wooden boards had been nailed carefully across a narrow hallway leading underground. Not collapsed, blocked. Leslie frowned. Why would someone do that? She pried one loose board away cautiously. Dust exploded into the air. Behind it, darkness stretched downward into what looked like an old storage tunnel beneath the mill. A chill moved across Leslie's skin. She aimed the flashlight carefully, but could only see several feet ahead before shadows swallowed everything else. For a moment, common sense told her to walk away. But curiosity won. It always had. Leslie stepped slowly into the tunnel boots, crunching against damp gravel. Water dripped somewhere ahead rhythmically. The tunnel walls were reinforced with old brick and timber support, surprisingly intact compared to the upper floors. Then her flashlight beam caught metal. Boxes. Dozens of them. Large sealed storage containers lined one side of the underground corridor, covered beneath layers of dust. Leslie knelt beside the nearest one, wiping grime away with her sleeve. Whitmore Textiles Records Division, 1987. Her pulse quickened. She pulled harder against the rusted latch until it finally snapped open with a sharp crack. Inside were stacks of old ledgers wrapped carefully in waterproof coverings. Not trash, not abandoned junk. Protected documents. Someone had hidden these deliberately. Leslie opened one carefully. Inside were handwritten inventory reports, shipping records, and correspondence dating back decades. Most people would have found the paperwork meaningless, but Leslie immediately recognized inconsistencies. Numbers altered, shipments missing, expenses erased. Her years inside factories had taught her how companies buried corruption behind paperwork. Ordinary workers never questioned. The deeper she searched, the clearer one thing became. The Whitmore Mill had not simply failed. Something had happened here, something ugly. A sudden crashing sound above startled Leslie violently. She spun around. Footsteps echoed faintly through the upper floor overhead. Someone else was inside the mill. Fear clenched instantly inside her chest. The property sat miles outside town. Nobody should have been there. Leslie grabbed an old metal pipe lying nearby instinctively and climbed carefully back toward the main floor. Another loud crash echoed through the building. "Hello!" a man's voice shouted. Leslie froze. The voice sounded older, calm, not threatening. Still gripping the pipe tightly, she stepped into the main production area. An older man stood near the entrance carrying a toolbox and staring upward at the damaged roof. Tall, broad-shouldered despite his age, gray beard, thick work jacket covered in sawdust. When he noticed Leslie, he lifted both hands immediately. "Easy," he said gently. "Didn't mean to scare you." Leslie lowered the pipe slowly but did not relax. "Who are you, Samuel Bennett?" He nodded toward the road outside. "I live about 2 miles east." His eyes drifted toward Leslie's pickup truck parked inside the mill. "You sleeping here?" Leslie hesitated. Samuel seemed to understand the answer anyway. Town's already talking about you, he said quietly. Then they should mind their own business. To Leslie's surprise, Samuel smiled faintly. That's probably true. He explained he had noticed headlights at the mill the night before and came to make sure nobody was hurt. The old structure had become dangerous over the years. Teenagers occasionally snuck inside looking for trouble. Samuel walked carefully around the building, inspecting damage silently. Finally, he stopped near one collapsed beam. This place isn't as far gone as people think. Leslie stared at him. You really believe that spent 40 years building houses? Samuel replied. People confuse neglected with hopeless. The words hit Leslie harder than she expected. Neglected with hopeless. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to her? Samuel pointed toward the western support wall. Foundation there still solid. Some roof sections, too. He paused. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing. For the next hour, they walked through the mill together. Samuel explained structural weaknesses while Leslie talked about the machinery. Slowly, conversation replaced suspicion. She learned Samuel had lost his wife Clara to cancer 6 years earlier. Since then, he mostly kept to himself doing repair jobs around Belcrest. You got family, he asked eventually. Leslie thought about Rebecca, about short phone calls filled with exhaustion and distance. A daughter, Leslie answered softly. We're complicated. Samuel nodded like a man who understood loneliness very well. Before leaving, he handed Leslie a folded piece of paper. What's this address? He shrugged. Small workshop behind my house. Got extra tools if you need them. Leslie blinked in surprise. You barely know me. Samuel looked around the ruined mill. Neither does anyone else. After he left, silence returned to the building once more. But somehow, it felt different now. Less empty. That afternoon, Leslie drove into Belcrest for supplies using the last cash hidden inside her glove compartment. The reactions came immediately. People stared openly when she entered the small hardware store. An older cashier recognized her from the auction. You really bought that old death trap? A man nearby laughed. She'll be lucky if the roof doesn't bury her alive. Another shook his head. Crazy thing is probably cursed anyway. Leslie said nothing. Humiliation burned inside her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm while buying cleaning supplies, canned food, and work gloves. As she carried the bags outside, 2 teenagers drove past, slowly yelling toward her. Hey, Grandma, find any ghosts yet? Laughter exploded from the truck before it disappeared down the road. Leslie stood alone in the parking lot, gripping the bags tightly. For one painful moment, she almost drove away from Belcrest forever. But then she remembered the hidden tunnel, the preserved records, the symbol carved beneath the beam. Someone had fought to protect something inside that mill, and after spending her entire life being overlooked, discarded, and underestimated. Leslie suddenly understood something important. People often mock what they do not bother trying to understand. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind frozen hills, Leslie returned to the mill carrying supplies in both arms. She stopped near the entrance and looked up at the massive broken structure towering over her. Everyone else saw ruins, but deep inside her heart, something had already begun changing. For the first time in years, Leslie Cook was no longer waiting for someone else to save her life. 3 days later, Leslie Cook stood knee-deep in freezing water inside the western section of the Whitmore Mill, gripping a rusted crowbar with aching hands. Everything hurt. Her shoulders burned from lifting debris. Her knees throbbed constantly from climbing over broken flooring and unstable beams. Even breathing felt heavy in the damp winter air. But for the first time in years, exhaustion carried purpose instead of humiliation. Each piece of debris she removed revealed more of the mill's hidden history. And the deeper Leslie looked, the more convinced she became that somebody had tried very hard to erase this place from memory. Sunlight filtered weakly through shattered upper windows, while Leslie dragged rotten wood away from an old drainage corridor near the back foundation wall. Samuel Bennett had returned early that morning carrying coffee and a toolbox without being asked. You know, he muttered while prying loose damaged planks nearby. Most people your age would have bought a camper in Florida. Leslie laughed softly for the first time in weeks. Most people my age probably have retirement money. Samuel glanced at her. There was no pity in his expression, only understanding. That mattered more than Leslie expected. By noon, they had cleared enough debris to expose part of the original lower flooring beneath years of flood damage. Thick stone tiles stretched across the room, surprisingly intact. Samuel crouched carefully beside one section near the wall. That's strange. Leslie stepped closer. What? He tapped the crowbar against the floor. The sound echoed differently there. Hollow. Both of them froze. Samuel hit the stone again. The same hollow sound answered beneath it. Leslie's pulse quickened instantly. There's space underneath. Together they cleared away more debris. Mud and soaked wood covered nearly everything, but eventually Samuel uncovered a rusted metal ring embedded into one large floor tile. A hatch, Leslie whispered. Samuel frowned. Or a buried death trap. Still, neither of them walked away. After several minutes of effort, the heavy stone hatch finally shifted open with a grinding groan that echoed through the mill. Cold air rushed upward from below, carrying the scent of damp paper rust and something strangely preserved beneath decades of darkness. Leslie aimed her flashlight downward. Stone stairs disappeared underground. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Samuel sighed. Well, he muttered, guess we're doing this. The underground chamber beneath the mill was far larger than either expected. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls beneath hanging industrial lights long dead from neglect. Wooden shelves filled with boxes stretched across the far side of the room. Unlike the ruined upper floors, this hidden archive remained mostly untouched, protected, preserved, intentional. Leslie moved slowly between shelves, stunned by what she saw. Documents, blueprints, old employee files, shipping records, thousands of pages carefully organized inside waterproof storage containers. This wasn't abandoned, she whispered. Samuel nodded quietly. Someone hid this place. Leslie's flashlight landed on an old framed photograph hanging crookedly near the back wall. A black and white image showed dozens of mill workers standing proudly outside the Whitmore building sometime during the 1970s. Families, children, smiling faces. The factory had once been the heart of Bellcrest. Leslie stepped closer to study the photo. Then something caught her attention. A woman stood near the center of the image beside several large textile machines. Strong posture, intelligent eyes, dark coat buttoned neatly despite the factory setting. On the bottom corner of the frame, faded handwriting remained barely visible. Margaret Whitmore. 1978, the owner, Samuel guessed. Maybe. Leslie continued deeper into the archive room. Several cabinets contained financial ledgers dating back decades, and almost immediately patterns began emerging. Leslie sat at an old desk flipping through records while Samuel inspected the room around them. These numbers don't make sense, she murmured. What numbers? Production reports. Leslie pointed carefully. The mill was profitable right before it shut down. Samuel frowned. That can't be right. Everybody around here says Whitmore Textiles went bankrupt. That's what they say. Leslie turned another page slowly. But these records show major contracts increasing before closure. The more she read, the stranger everything became. Large payments vanished from accounts suddenly. Shipping contracts disappeared without explanation. Entire equipment inventories were transferred to outside companies weeks before the mill officially collapsed financially. It looked less like bankruptcy and more like sabotage. Samuel leaned against a cabinet thoughtfully. You think somebody stole the company? Leslie thought about Richard Coleman, about executives hiding behind polished smiles while destroying workers' lives. Corporate greed rarely changed. Only the faces did. I think somebody wanted this place dead, Leslie answered quietly. Hours passed underground. For the first time in years, Leslie felt mentally alive again. Her instincts from decades inside factories sharpened with every ledger she examined. She understood operations, supply chains, production manipulation. And the deeper she searched, the clearer one fact became. The Whitmore mill had been destroyed deliberately. Then Leslie found the blueprints. Tucked inside a sealed drafting tube beneath the desk were detailed designs unlike anything she expected. Samuel unrolled them carefully across the table. What is all this? Leslie stared silently. Textile machinery. But not ordinary machinery. The design showed modified weaving systems using an unusual thread layering process Leslie had never seen before. Handwritten notes covered the margins. Temperature controls. Fiber tension formulas. Material preservation techniques. Her breathing slowed. This is advanced, she whispered. Advanced how? Leslie shook her head in disbelief. Factories today still struggle with sustainable fiber durability. She pointed toward one section. But this process? She stopped. No, impossible. Samuel watched her carefully. What Leslie looked up slowly. This design could produce fabric twice as durable using half the material. Silence filled the underground room. Even Samuel understood the significance immediately. Then why bury it down here? Leslie turned another page. At the bottom corner, someone had stamped the blueprint with one word in red ink. Rejected. Below it sat several handwritten signatures from corporate investors Leslie did not recognize, but one company name appeared repeatedly beside them. Coleman Industrial Holdings. Leslie's stomach tightened instantly. The name couldn't be coincidence. Could it? Before she could think further, her phone vibrated inside her jacket pocket. Rebecca. Leslie hesitated before answering. Hi. Her daughter sounded exhausted immediately. Mom, where are you at the mill? A long silence followed. You're still there, Leslie closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Rebecca exhaled sharply. Mom, this has gone far enough. There it was again, embarrassment, not concern. Leslie glanced around the underground archive filled with hidden history. You don't understand. No, Rebecca snapped. You don't understand. People are talking about you. Greg saw photos online. Everyone thinks you've lost your mind. Pain moved quietly through Leslie's chest. When your father died, she said softly, I worked 16-hour shifts so you could eat. Rebecca fell silent. I missed birthdays, school plays, holidays. Leslie swallowed hard. Everything I did was for this family. I know that. Do you... Another silence. Finally, Rebecca spoke quietly. You need help, Mom. Leslie looked toward the blueprints again, toward the evidence someone tried to bury forever. Maybe for the first time in her life. She did not want saving. Maybe she wanted purpose. I'll call you later, Leslie whispered. Then she ended the call. Samuel said nothing for a long time after that. Finally, he walked toward the stairs. You know, he said quietly, most people spend their whole lives waiting for permission to matter. Leslie looked at him. What if I'm wrong about all this? Samuel shrugged gently. What if you're not? That night, Leslie remained alone inside the archive long after Samuel left. Rain hammered against the mill overhead while she studied the forgotten blueprints beneath flashlight glow. The room no longer felt abandoned. It felt hidden, protected, waiting, and deep inside herself. Leslie realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. For decades, she had believed her life was ending because the world no longer needed her. But sitting there beneath the ruins of the Whitmore Mill, she began wondering if everything that happened before had only been preparing her for this moment, for this discovery, for this fight. And somewhere in the darkness above her, the broken old mill groaned softly beneath the storm, as if awakening with her. The rumors spread through Bellcrest faster than Leslie Cook expected. By the following week, people no longer referred to her by name. They called her the mill woman, the crazy old widow living inside the cursed factory. At the Bellcrest diner, truck drivers laughed openly about her while drinking coffee before sunrise. She's probably hunting ghosts down there. Heard the roof's gonna collapse any day now. One good storm, and they'll be pulling her body out of the river. Even people who felt sorry for Leslie spoke about her like someone already lost. Only Samuel Bennett continued showing up every morning. Sometimes he brought tools, sometimes coffee, sometimes just quiet company. That mattered more than Leslie admitted aloud. On cold mornings, they worked side by side, clearing debris from the western production wing while weak winter sunlight filtered through broken windows overhead. Samuel repaired damaged support beams carefully while Leslie cataloged records from the underground archive at night. And slowly the mill began changing. Not dramatically, not enough for outsiders to notice, but enough for Leslie to feel it breathing again. One afternoon, while sweeping shattered glass from an old office corridor, Leslie uncovered faded lettering painted beneath years of grime. Whitmore Textiles built with pride. 1948. She stood silently staring at the words, built with pride. When had companies stopped caring about that? At Harper Textile, everything eventually became numbers, efficiency, replacement costs, profit margins. Workers stopped being human beings somewhere along the way. Leslie remembered younger executives discussing layoffs while eating catered lunches inside heated conference rooms. None of them understood what factory work actually cost people. The broken backs, the destroyed joints, the missed birthdays, the marriages that collapsed under financial pressure. People like Leslie gave entire lives to places that forgot them the second productivity slowed. But the Whitmore Mill felt different. Even abandoned the building carried dignity, and Leslie was beginning to understand why. That evening, Samuel sat beside an old barrel fire near the loading entrance while Leslie studied another stack of recovered ledgers. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. Leslie looked up. "Leaving Bellcrest? Leaving all this?" Samuel gestured toward the enormous ruined structure surrounding them, walking away before it gets harder. Leslie stared into the fire quietly. A month ago, she would have answered yes immediately. Now she wasn't sure. Every day she admitted softly. Samuel nodded like he expected that answer, but Leslie hesitated. Then she reached into one nearby box and handed him an old photograph she had discovered earlier. It showed dozens of Whitmore workers gathered outside the mill during Christmas sometime in the early 80s. Families stood together smiling proudly despite worn clothing and exhausted faces. Samuel studied the image carefully. "They look happy. They look needed," Leslie corrected quietly. The difference mattered. Before Samuel could respond, headlights suddenly swept across the loading entrance outside. A black county SUV rolled slowly toward the building. Leslie's stomach tightened instantly. Two men stepped out wearing heavy winter coats embroidered with county inspection services. The older man approached first carrying a clipboard. "You Leslie Cook?" "Yes." He glanced toward the mill disapprovingly. "We received complaints about unauthorized occupancy inside a condemned structure." "Complaints?" "Of course." Leslie folded her arms tightly against the cold. "I own this property. Ownership doesn't override safety regulations." The inspector flipped through paperwork casually. "This building was classified structurally hazardous 19 years ago." Samuel stepped forward calmly. "I've inspected several sections personally. Western supports remain stable." The inspector barely acknowledged him. "We'll determine that ourselves." For the next hour, the inspectors moved through the mill, taking photographs and writing notes while Leslie followed silently. Every broken beam, every cracked wall, every unstable section became another excuse to threaten closure. Finally, the older inspector stopped near the main production floor. "Miss Cook," he sighed, "this structure realistically should be demolished." Leslie's chest tightened painfully. Demolished, like her career, like her future. Like every older worker companies discarded once they stopped being profitable. "How much time do I have?" she asked quietly. The man checked his clipboard. "Pending final review, maybe 30 days before mandatory action." 30 days. Samuel's jaw tightened instantly. "That's not enough time for assessment appeals." The inspector shrugged. "Not my decision." But Leslie noticed something strange. Before leaving, the younger inspector handed the older man a folded document quietly near the SUV. On the corner of the paper, Leslie caught sight of a familiar logo, Coleman Industrial Holdings. Her blood ran cold. That night, Leslie sat alone inside the underground archive, unable to focus. Rain hammered outside while fear slowly returned to her chest. 30 days. How could she possibly save the mill in 30 days? She barely had enough money for food. The building needed repairs far beyond her abilities, and now someone powerful clearly wanted the property destroyed permanently. Her phone rang suddenly. "Rebecca." Leslie almost ignored it. Almost. "Hi." Rebecca sounded stressed immediately. "Mom, someone sent me pictures." Leslie closed her eyes. Of course they did. Social media had turned her humiliation into entertainment for strangers. "They're saying you're living inside some condemned factory." "I'm managing." "Managing," Rebecca snapped. "Mom, this is insane." Leslie rubbed tiredly at her forehead. "You don't understand what this place is." "No," Rebecca fired back emotionally. "I understand exactly what it is. It's another disaster waiting to happen." Pain sharpened between them instantly. Years of buried resentment lived beneath every conversation now. You think I wanted this life for us? Leslie whispered suddenly. Silence answered her. When your father got sick, I worked until my hands bled trying to keep us afloat. Leslie's voice trembled. I did everything I could. Rebecca inhaled shakily. You also missed everything. The words hit like a knife. Leslie said nothing, because Rebecca wasn't entirely wrong. I needed a mother. Rebecca continued softly. But the factory always came first. Leslie stared at the old records surrounding her. 43 years sacrificed to survive. And still it had not been enough. Finally, Rebecca spoke again, quieter this time. Please come home, Mom. Home. The word felt strange now. Pittsburgh no longer felt like home. Harper Textile certainly didn't. Oddly enough, the broken mill did. I can't leave yet, Leslie whispered. Rebecca sounded exhausted. I don't even recognize you anymore. After the call ended, Leslie sat motionless for a long time. Those words hurt because part of her feared they were true. The old Leslie Cook would have surrendered already. The old Leslie accepted humiliation quietly, accepted replacement, accepted invisibility. But something inside her had begun changing beneath the ruins of Whitmore Mill, and she could not force herself backward again. The next morning brought worse news. Leslie stepped outside carrying scrap wood when she froze instantly. Red spray paint covered the front brick wall near the entrance. Go home, old woman. Below it, let the mill die. Leslie stood motionless in the freezing wind. Her chest tightened painfully. People truly wanted her gone, not because she hurt anyone, not because she broke laws, simply because she refused to disappear quietly. Samuel arrived 30 minutes later and immediately grabbed cleaning supplies without speaking. Together they scrubbed paint from the bricks silently. Halfway through, Leslie suddenly stopped. I'm tired, she whispered. Samuel looked at her carefully. I know. No. Leslie shook her head slowly. I mean, tired all the way down. Years of grief surfaced inside her voice. The factory, Thomas, bills, loneliness, failure, every sacrifice that never seemed enough. Samuel leaned against the wall beside her. You know what scares people? He asked quietly. Leslie looked at him weakly. People who survive after they were supposed to break. The words settled deeply inside her. Across the frozen property, wind moved through the shattered mill windows with a low, haunting sound. For years, Leslie Cook believed aging meant becoming smaller, quieter, less important. But standing there beneath cruel words painted by strangers, she realized something powerful. The world had spent decades teaching people like her to disappear politely. And maybe that was exactly why she refused to leave. The letter was found by accident. Leslie Cook had not been looking for secrets that morning. She had been looking for rot. After the county inspection notice, Samuel Bennett insisted they check every damaged interior wall before attempting repairs. If they could prove certain parts of the mill were stable, maybe they could delay demolition long enough to file an appeal. It was a thin hope. But thin hope was still hope. The old administrative office sat above the western wing, hidden behind a warped wooden door with cracked frosted glass. The words "Manager's Office" remained faintly painted across it, though half the letters had peeled away. Inside, dust covered everything. A broken desk leaned against one wall. File drawers lay scattered across the floor. A calendar from 1987 still hung crookedly near the window, frozen forever in the month of October. Leslie stood in the doorway for a moment, strangely emotional. Someone had once worked here every day. Someone had answered phones, signed checks, worried about payroll, watched workers walk through the courtyard below. Now the room looked like a memory left to decay. Samuel tapped the lower wall with the handle of his hammer. Water damage here, he said. We'll need to strip this paneling. Leslie nodded and began pulling loose boards away carefully. For an hour they worked in silence. The cold slipped through the broken window, turning their breath white. Then Leslie's crowbar struck something metal behind the wall. Clink. She paused. Samuel looked over. What was that? Leslie pried another strip of paneling loose. Behind the wall, wedged between two studs, was a small rectangular tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart began to beat faster. Samuel stepped closer, but said nothing. Leslie lifted the box with both hands. It was lighter than she expected, but carefully sealed. Someone had hidden it with the same intention as the underground archive. Not forgotten, protected. She set it on the damaged desk and slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay three things: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a strip of fabric unlike anything Leslie had ever touched. The fabric shimmered softly in the gray winter light. It was plain ivory, almost humble, yet when Leslie lifted it between her fingers it felt impossibly strong. Smooth like fine linen, flexible like cotton, dense without being heavy. Her breath caught. Samuel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Leslie rubbed the material gently between thumb and forefinger. "I don't know," she whispered, "but this shouldn't feel like this." Then she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, firm, and deeply personal. "To whoever finds this, if this mill has fallen silent, then the men who wanted it dead have likely won for a while. But silence is not the same as defeat." Leslie's throat tightened. She glanced at the signature at the bottom. Margaret Whitmore, the woman from the photograph. Leslie continued reading aloud, her voice low and reverent. Margaret wrote that Whitmore Textiles had spent nearly 12 years developing a fiber weaving process that could make fabric stronger, longer lasting, and less wasteful than anything major manufacturers were willing to produce at the time. It used careful layering, precise tension control, and a natural fiber treatment her father had first experimented with after World War II. The process was not merely profitable, it was humane. It reduced material waste. It made garments last longer. It could have kept small mills alive by giving them a product large corporations could not cheaply imitate without skilled labor. But that was exactly why investors hated it. Margaret had refused to sell the process to industrial partners who wanted to patent it, close the mill, and move production overseas. She believed the people who built the process deserved to benefit from it, so the investors punished her. Contracts vanished. Bank loans were withdrawn. Suppliers were pressured. Invoices were manipulated. And when Margaret fought back, they painted her as unstable, stubborn, and financially reckless. Leslie stopped reading. Her hands trembled. The words felt too familiar. A woman dismissed as irrational because powerful men wanted what she protected. Samuel's jaw hardened. "Keep going," he said quietly. Leslie swallowed and continued. Margaret wrote that she had hidden the final formula machine settings and proof of sabotage throughout the mill because she feared the building would someday be seized or destroyed. She believed one honest person, someone overlooked, someone patient, someone who understood work with their hands might one day find it. Then came the sentence that broke something open inside Leslie's chest. "If you are reading this, then perhaps the world has thrown you away too. Do not believe it. Forgotten people are often the last ones still capable of telling the truth." Leslie lowered the page. For several seconds she could not speak. All her life she had carried pain quietly because there had never been time to honor it. Thomas's illness, the factory shifts, Rebecca's resentment, Richard Coleman's theft, her firing, the humiliation of sleeping in a truck while strangers laughed at her online. And now across decades, a dead woman seemed to be speaking directly to the wound Leslie had tried so hard to ignore. Samuel watched her gently. She knew Leslie whispered. Samuel nodded. "Maybe not your name, but she knew the kind of person who'd find it." Leslie looked down at the fabric sample again. The mill's true value had never been the land, not the brick walls, not even the machines. It was knowledge. It was dignity preserved in secret. It was proof that greed had buried something good because goodness was harder to control. The brass key led them back underground. After searching the archive cabinets for nearly 2 hours, Samuel found a locked steel drawer beneath an old drafting table. The key fit perfectly. Inside were more notes, precise formulas, machine calibration charts, thread tension ratios, fiber treatment instructions, and a handwritten label, Whitmore Durable Weave. Final process. Leslie sat down slowly. She understood enough to know the process was real. Complicated, yes. Old-fashioned, yes. But brilliant. The kind of brilliance modern executives overlooked because it came from workers, not boardrooms. "We need to test it," Samuel said. Leslie gave a startled laugh. "With what half the equipment upstairs is dead." "Half," Samuel replied. "Not all." He had already inspected several smaller machines in the side production room. One old sample loom remained partly intact beneath dust and rust. It needed cleaning replacement belts, rewiring, and patience. Patience Leslie had. Money she did not. But Samuel disappeared that afternoon and returned with a box of spare parts from his workshop. Over the next several days, the ruined mill became something between a laboratory and a prayer. Samuel repaired what he could. Leslie cleaned gears, studied Margaret's notes, adjusted mechanisms by feel and memory. Her hands hurt constantly, but they moved with renewed certainty. She knew machines, she knew thread, she knew stubborn systems that refused to run until someone listened closely enough. On the fourth night, the sample loom finally moved. Not smoothly, not beautifully, but it moved. The old motor coughed, shuddered, and then began turning with a rhythm Leslie had not heard since Harper Textile. Her eyes filled instantly. Samuel stood beside her, smiling quietly. Leslie fed the prepared thread through the system according to Margaret's instructions. Slowly, painfully, the loom began weaving. A narrow strip of fabric emerged inch by inch, ivory, dense, strong, alive. Leslie touched it with shaking fingers. It matched the sample. For the first time since buying the mill, joy broke through her fear completely. Not loud joy, not easy joy, the kind that rose from the deepest place in a wounded person when they realized they had not reached the end after all. Samuel removed his cap and stared at the fabric. "Well," he said softly, "I think Margaret Whitmore just woke up." Leslie laughed through tears. Outside the mill remained broken. The county still threatened demolition. Richard Coleman still lurked somewhere beyond the edge of the story, powerful and dangerous. But inside that small room beneath a leaking roof and surrounded by rusted machinery, Leslie held proof in her hands. Proof that the past had not died. Proof that she was not useless. Proof that something discarded could still become extraordinary. And as the loom kept moving slow but steady, Leslie Cook felt a truth settle into her bones. She had spent her final dollar on ruins, but maybe what she had really bought was the chance to become herself again. The first person to touch the Whitmore fabric outside the mill was a woman named Diane Mercer. She owned a tiny upholstery shop in Belcrest that most people ignored while driving through town. Her storefront sat squeezed between a laundromat and an abandoned pharmacy, surviving mostly on furniture repairs and custom curtain orders. Samuel knew her from years earlier. "She's honest," he told Leslie one snowy morning, "and she knows quality when she sees it." Leslie hesitated before agreeing to meet her. Part of her still feared humiliation every time she stepped into town. But she wrapped the narrow sample carefully inside brown paper anyway and followed Samuel to Diane's shop. The bell above the entrance door jingled softly when they entered. Diane looked up from behind a sewing machine, adjusting her glasses. "Well," she said dryly, "either somebody finally brought me customers or trouble." Samuel smirked. "Maybe both." Leslie introduced herself awkwardly, suddenly self-conscious about her worn coat and tired appearance. Diane recognized her immediately. "You're the woman living at Whitmore Mill. Not cruel, just factual." Leslie nodded cautiously. Diane held out her hand. "Let me see it." Leslie unfolded the fabric sample slowly across the counter. For several seconds, Diane said nothing. Then her expression changed. Professional curiosity replaced casual politeness instantly. She lifted the material toward the light, bent it carefully between her fingers, rubbed the weave against her palm. "What is this?" Leslie exchanged a glance with Samuel. "We're still figuring that out." Diane tested the fabric harder now, pulling against it experimentally. It shouldn't be this durable at this weight. Leslie felt her pulse quicken. Someone else saw it too. Diane turned the sample over repeatedly. "This isn't imported, no. Where was it made?" Leslie swallowed softly. "At Whitmore Mill." Silence. Then Diane laughed once in disbelief. "You're serious?" Leslie nodded. For the next 20 minutes, Diane questioned them intensely about the process, machinery, and source materials. Leslie answered carefully without revealing Margaret Whitmore's documents or the hidden archive. Finally, Diane leaned back slowly. "If you can reproduce this consistently," she paused, "you might actually have something." The words should have felt hopeful. Instead, fear crept into Leslie's stomach. Because if small-town shop owners recognized the fabric's value so quickly, soon other people would too, and powerful people rarely ignored profit. By the following week, whispers about Whitmore Mill began changing. Not completely. Many still mocked Leslie openly. But curiosity had entered the conversation now. Diane quietly used part of the sample to repair an expensive antique chair for a wealthy customer in Pittsburgh. The client immediately noticed the unusual durability and texture. Questions spread. Where did this material come from? Meanwhile, Leslie and Samuel worked almost non-stop inside the mill, trying to stabilize the sample loom and reproduce the weaving process consistently. The work was brutal. Old machines jammed constantly. Replacement parts were nearly impossible to find. Heating barely functioned in the freezing building, but every successful fabric strip strengthened Leslie's confidence. Margaret Whitmore had been telling the truth. One afternoon, Leslie sat inside the underground archive, organizing financial records when Samuel descended the stairs carrying a newspaper. His face looked troubled. What happened? Leslie asked immediately. Samuel handed her the paper silently. Across the front page of the Bellcrest Gazette sat a photograph of Leslie standing outside the mill, holding lumber beside the headline, "Local Woman Attempts to Reopen Condemned Mill." Below it, the article questioned the legality and safety of Leslie's activities, while describing Whitmore Mill as a dangerous relic tied to decades of financial collapse. But one paragraph made Leslie's blood run cold. Sources connected to Coleman Industrial Holdings expressed concern about unauthorized use of potentially patented textile methods associated with historical Whitmore operations. Leslie stared at the sentence. How do they know? Samuel's expression darkened. They've been watching. Fear settled heavily between them. Coleman Industrial Holdings. Richard Coleman. The same corporate name buried throughout Margaret Whitmore's hidden records. The same people tied to the destruction of the original mill. And now they knew Leslie had found something. 2 days later, Richard Coleman arrived personally. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly across the frozen road toward Whitmore Mill just before sunset. Leslie recognized him immediately, even before he stepped out. Perfect coat, perfect haircut, perfect corporate smile. The kind of man who always looked comfortable while other people struggled. Samuel moved beside Leslie instinctively as Richard approached. Leslie Richard greeted warmly as if they were old friends. You look well. That lie alone made Leslie dislike him more. What do you want? Richard glanced toward the mill with calculated interest. I heard rumors. He smiled faintly. I have to admit I didn't believe them at first. Leslie crossed her arms tightly. There's nothing here for you. Oh, I think there might be. Samuel stepped forward coldly. You should leave. Richard ignored him completely. Instead, he looked directly at Leslie. You spent decades in manufacturing, he said smoothly. You understand how difficult large-scale production really is. Leslie remained silent. This property is unstable, Richard continued. The county plans to condemn it permanently. He paused. But I may be able to help. There it was, not concern. Acquisition. How generous, Leslie replied bitterly. Richard smiled like a patient teacher speaking to a stubborn child. I'm prepared to purchase the mill from you. He named a number large enough to make Leslie's breath catch slightly. Cash. Samuel cursed under his breath. Weeks earlier, Leslie had possessed $1. Now a corporation wanted the property badly enough to offer her more money than she had seen in years. Richard saw hesitation flicker across her face and pressed harder. You could retire comfortably, he said softly. No more sleeping in a condemned building. No more public embarrassment. Public embarrassment. The phrase hit intentionally. Richard knew exactly how Bellcrest talked about her. He stepped closer. Leslie. You already gave enough of your life to factories. Let professionals handle the rest. Professionals. Men like him. Men who stole ideas from workers and called it business. Men who destroyed towns while hiding behind polished language. Leslie looked at the broken mill behind her. Then she remembered Margaret Whitmore's letter. Forgotten people are often the last ones still capable of telling the truth. Slowly, Leslie shook her head. No. Richard blinked once. I'm sorry I said no. For the first time, irritation cracked his perfect expression. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Leslie surprised herself by stepping closer instead of backward. No, she replied quietly. I think I finally do. Silence stretched between them. Then Richard straightened his coat calmly. You should be careful, Leslie. His voice lost all warmth now. Old buildings collapse unexpectedly. The threat hung there openly. Samuel moved instantly. You done here? Richard glanced once more toward the mill before returning to his SUV. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, Leslie realized her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from anger. "He's scared," Samuel said quietly. Leslie looked at him. Men like that only smile when they believe they already own everything. Samuel nodded toward the departing SUV. "You just told him no." That night, snowstorm whines rattled the broken windows violently while Leslie sat inside the archive reading more of Margaret Whitmore's records. The deeper she dug, the uglier the truth became. Manipulated contracts, forced bankruptcies, threats hidden behind legal paperwork. Entire communities destroyed so investors could move production elsewhere for higher profits. And suddenly Leslie understood why Whitmore Mill mattered beyond fabric. It was proof. Proof that ordinary workers had been sacrificed deliberately for greed. Proof that people like Richard Coleman continued benefiting from systems built decades earlier. Around midnight, headlights flashed outside again. Leslie froze instantly. But this time it wasn't Richard. County inspection vehicles rolled into the property. 3 inspectors stepped out carrying official notices. The older man approached Leslie grimly. "Miss Cook, after further review, Bellcrest County has issued an emergency structural seizure order." Leslie's stomach dropped. "What the property is now considered an immediate public hazard." He handed her paperwork. "All occupancy and operational activity must cease within 72 hours. Samuel grabbed the notice angrily. "This is retaliation, and you know it." The inspector avoided eye contact. "I'm just doing my job." "No." Leslie realized the truth instantly. This was not about safety. Richard Coleman had made his move. And for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Mill, Leslie truly understood the scale of the fight waiting for her. Because powerful people were no longer laughing at her. Now they were trying to silence her. The fire began just after midnight. Leslie Cook woke to the smell before she saw the flames. Smoke. Thick. Bitter. Fast. For one disoriented second, she thought she was back at Harper Textile during the electrical fire of 1998, the one management blamed on exhausted workers instead of faulty maintenance they had ignored for years. Then reality crashed into her. Whitmore Mill. Leslie jerked upright inside the small office space she had converted into a temporary sleeping area. Orange light flickered violently beneath the doorway. Her heart slammed against her ribs. No! The hallway outside already glowed with fire. Heat punched through the air as Leslie stumbled into the corridor, coughing violently. Flames crawled across the old wooden walls faster than seemed possible, feeding hungrily on decades of dry timber hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. Someone had set this deliberately. The realization came instantly. Fires in old buildings usually crept. This one exploded. Leslie grabbed the nearest extinguisher mounted beside the stairwell and pulled the pin with trembling hands. Nothing. Dead. Of course. Panic surged through her chest. She turned toward the archive stairs instinctively. Margaret's records, the blueprints, the fabric process. Everything was down there. But another section of ceiling collapsed nearby with a deafening crash, showering sparks across the floor. The mill groaned around her like a wounded animal. Leslie froze. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore, genuine terror overtook her determination. She could die here, alone. Burned inside the ruins everyone warned her about. Outside wind pushed flames through shattered windows, feeding the fire faster. Leslie wrapped part of her coat across her mouth and forced herself toward the archive entrance anyway. Not for the mill, not even for herself. For the truth. Margaret Whitmore had spent decades protecting those records because powerful men buried them once already. Leslie could not let them disappear forever. Smoke thickened rapidly as she descended the underground stairs, coughing hard enough to tear pain through her chest. The archive remained untouched for now, but heat seeped downward already. Leslie grabbed boxes desperately, ledgers, blueprint tubes, letters, anything she could carry. Her arms shook under the weight, then suddenly a beam crashed somewhere above. The lights flickered once, the entire underground chamber trembled. Leslie's fear finally broke through completely. She was running out of time. Tears blurred her eyes from smoke and panic as she struggled toward the stairs carrying 2 heavy boxes against her chest. Halfway up, dizziness hit violently. She stumbled. One box slipped from her grasp, papers exploding across the stairwell. Leslie dropped to her knees, instinctively gathering documents with frantic hands while smoke rolled downward toward her. Everything hurt. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, and deep inside herself, one terrible thought surfaced. Maybe Richard Coleman was right. Maybe people like her were not meant to win. Then another voice shattered through the chaos above. Leslie Samuel. Relief nearly broke her apart. Down here, she screamed hoarsely. Heavy footsteps thundered toward the stairwell. Seconds later, Samuel appeared through smoke carrying a flashlight and fire blanket. His face went pale instantly. What the hell are you doing? The records. Forget the damn records. He grabbed her arm hard enough to force her upright. Another violent crack echoed overhead. The stairwell ceiling partially collapsed behind them. Samuel's expression changed instantly. Pure fear. Move together. They fought upward through smoke and heat while flames consumed the upper hallway. Leslie clutched the rescued box against her chest desperately, even while coughing uncontrollably. Outside, freezing air hit them both like ice water. Leslie collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for breath, while Samuel dragged the remaining boxes away from the entrance. The fire had already spread across nearly half the western wing. Flames roared through broken roof sections, illuminating the snowy landscape in violent orange light. Bellcrest volunteer fire crews arrived minutes later, but Leslie could tell immediately from their faces that saving the mill would be impossible. The old structure burned too fast, too hot, too completely. She stood wrapped in Samuel's heavy coat while firefighters battled the inferno through the night. Snow melted instantly around the flames. Water hoses hissed uselessly against collapsing timber and exploding windows. And Leslie watched months of hope burn apart before her eyes. By dawn, half of Whitmore Mill was gone. Black smoke drifted upward into the gray Pennsylvania sky while firefighters searched the ruins for hidden hotspots. Leslie sat silently on the tailgate of her pickup truck, staring at the destruction. Samuel handed her coffee carefully. She didn't take it. I failed, she whispered. Samuel looked at her sharply. No, it's gone. Not all of it. Leslie laughed bitterly. You saw it. Yes, Samuel replied firmly, and I also saw you run into a burning building to save the truth. The words hit her unexpectedly hard. Across the ruined property, townspeople gathered quietly behind police tape now. Some looked shocked, some guilty, some curious, but nobody laughed anymore. Then Leslie saw a familiar car approaching slowly through the crowd. Rebecca. Her daughter stepped out wearing a long winter coat, face pale with fear. The moment Rebecca saw the destruction, tears filled her eyes instantly. Mom. Leslie suddenly realized how terrifying this must have looked from the outside. An elderly woman alone inside a condemned mill, consumed by fire in the middle of nowhere. Rebecca hurried toward her and stopped only inches away. You could have died. The words cracked emotionally. Leslie looked away. I know, but Rebecca wasn't angry anymore. For the first time since Leslie arrived in Bellcrest, all the resentment seemed stripped away by fear. Rebecca stared at the ruined mill in disbelief. You were really living here. Not mocking now, understanding, or trying to. Leslie nodded silently. Rebecca's voice trembled. Why? Leslie looked toward the surviving section of the building where smoke still curled through broken windows. Because this place mattered, because she mattered, because after a lifetime of being used and discarded, Whitmore Mill had given her something she thought was gone forever, purpose. But the answer that finally came out was simpler, because nobody else cared enough to stay. Rebecca broke down crying quietly, and suddenly Leslie saw something she had missed for years. Her daughter was tired too. Tired of debt, tired of fear, tired of growing up watching survival consume her mother piece by piece. They had both spent decades grieving different versions of the same loss. Late that afternoon, after investigators began examining the site, Samuel approached Leslie carrying something wrapped in cloth. What's that? The fire chief found it near the back loading area. He unwrapped the object carefully. A metal gasoline can, half melted. Leslie stared at it silently. Proof. Samuel crouched beside her. One of the firefighters said burn patterns don't match an accidental electrical fire. Leslie's stomach tightened. Someone really had tried to destroy everything. Not just the building, the evidence, the process, the truth Margaret Whitmore buried. Rebecca looked between them anxiously. You think somebody did this on purpose? Samuel's expression darkened. I'd bet my house on it. Before Leslie could answer, another vehicle pulled onto the property, a black SUV. Richard Coleman stepped out slowly. Perfect coat, perfect composure, best feature is as if he had arrived to inspect damaged inventory instead of human devastation. Rage moved through Leslie so sharply it almost frightened her. Richard approached carefully, shaking his head with rehearsed sympathy. "My God," he murmured, "I heard about the fire this morning." Liar. Leslie saw it instantly now. The performance. The false concern. The calculated timing. Richard glanced toward the ruins thoughtfully. Terrible tragedy. Samuel stepped forward immediately. "You need to leave." But Richard ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at Leslie. "I hope you understand now," he said quietly, "that some things can't be rebuilt." The sentence carried no sympathy, only warning. And suddenly Leslie understood something terrifying. The fire had not only been punishment, it was a message. Walk away. Stay silent. Disappear quietly. Exactly what the world had demanded from people like her entire life. Leslie slowly stood despite the exhaustion tearing through her body. Smoke drifted behind her across the ruins of Whitmore Mill. For a long moment, she simply stared at Richard Coleman. Then she spoke softly. "You're wrong." Richard's expression tightened slightly. Leslie's voice grew steadier. "You burned the building." Tears filled her eyes. "But you should have buried me when you had the chance." Silence settled heavily between them. Because for the first time, Richard Coleman realized Leslie Cook was no longer afraid of him. For 3 days after the fire, Leslie Cook barely spoke. She moved through the blackened remains of Whitmore Mill like someone walking through a graveyard. The western wing was gone completely. Collapsed beams lay buried beneath ash and frozen water from fire hoses. Burned machinery twisted upward like broken skeletons against the gray winter sky. The office where Leslie had slept smelled of smoke-melted insulation and wet charcoal. Everywhere she looked, there were pieces of destroyed hope. And yet, not everything had burned. The underground archive survived. So had Margaret Whitmore's core records. And somehow, despite the destruction surrounding her, Leslie no longer felt defeated. Angry, yes. Exhausted, absolutely. But not defeated, because the fire had changed something important. Before people laughed at her, now they were watching. The story spread beyond Bellcrest after local firefighters quietly confirmed the blaze looked suspicious. Then photos appeared online showing an elderly woman standing in front of the burning mill, clutching boxes of rescued documents against her chest. People began asking questions. Why would anyone burn an abandoned textile mill? And why did a major manufacturing company seem so interested in stopping one old woman? On the fourth morning, Samuel arrived carrying coffee and 3 newspapers tucked beneath his arm. "You need to see this." Leslie sat beside the barrel fire near the loading entrance while he spread the papers across an overturned crate. Pittsburgh Ledger. Mystery fire. At historic mill raises questions, Pennsylvania Business Journal. Dispute over abandoned textile property. Deepens. Bellcrest Gazette, local woman claims corporate cover-up. Leslie stared silently at the headlines. For the first time in years, people were listening to someone like her, not because she was powerful, because she survived long enough to speak. Samuel pointed toward the Business Journal article. "Read that part." Leslie adjusted her glasses. The article referenced historical financial records connecting Coleman Industrial Holdings to several textile acquisitions during the late 1980s, including companies that collapsed shortly before their patents or machinery were transferred elsewhere. Her pulse quickened. "They're starting to see it." Samuel nodded grimly. "Not enough yet." "No, not enough." Richard Coleman still had money, lawyers, political influence. People like him rarely lost unless the truth became impossible to bury. That afternoon, Rebecca returned to the mill carrying 2 laptops folders and enough groceries to feed 3 people for a week. Leslie blinked in surprise. "You came back." Rebecca looked around at the burned ruins quietly. "I couldn't stop thinking about this place." There was no resentment in her voice now, only sadness and curiosity. Samuel helped unload supplies while Rebecca sat beside Leslie near the surviving archive entrance. For several awkward minutes, neither spoke. Then Rebecca finally asked softly, "Can I see the records?" Leslie studied her daughter carefully. Rebecca looked tired in ways Leslie suddenly recognized too well. dark circles beneath her eyes, constant tension in her shoulders. The expression of someone who spent years surviving financially instead of living emotionally. Leslie realized with painful clarity that Rebecca had inherited more from her than she ever intended. Fear, stress, exhaustion. She nodded slowly. Together they descended into the archive. Rebecca's expression changed immediately when she saw the preserved records filling the underground chamber. Oh my God. For hours, Leslie explained everything. Margaret Whitmore, the hidden process, the manipulated bankruptcy records, the threats, the fire. Rebecca listened silently while reviewing financial ledgers and investor transfers on her laptop. Then, suddenly, she froze. Mom. Leslie looked up. Rebecca turned the screen slowly toward her. I found Richard Coleman. A cold knot tightened instantly in Leslie's chest. Rebecca pointed toward corporate acquisition filings. Coleman Industrial Holdings inherited assets from 3 companies tied to Whitmore's collapse. She clicked another document open. And look at this. A second name appeared repeatedly beside the transfers. Blackridge Capital Partners. The same investment group Margaret Whitmore referenced repeatedly in her letters decades earlier. Samuel leaned closer. That's the company that pressured Whitmore suppliers. Rebecca nodded grimly. They didn't just destroy the mill. She swallowed hard. They absorbed everything around it afterward. The room fell silent. Leslie suddenly understood the full scale of what happened. Whitmore Mill had never failed naturally. It had been dismantled piece by piece so investors could profit from its death. Just like modern factories close towns today, while executives collected bonuses elsewhere. Different decade. Same greed. Rebecca continued searching through records late into the evening. Then she found something worse. Mom. Her voice shook slightly now. These signatures. Leslie stepped beside her. Several historical transfer approvals carried names tied directly to present-day Coleman executives, including Richard Coleman's father. Samuel cursed softly under his breath. It stayed in the family. Leslie sat down slowly. Generation after generation profiting from buried workers, broken towns, and stolen ideas. And suddenly she remembered something Richard once told employees during restructuring meetings at Harper Textile. Business requires difficult sacrifices. No. Other people made the sacrifices. Men like Richard collected rewards afterward. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 elderly men arrived together in an old pickup truck just after sunrise. Former Whitmore workers. One introduced himself as Harold Green, 81 years old, former machine supervisor. Another, Frank Delaney, had worked maintenance for 27 years before the mill shut down. The third barely spoke at all. His name was Walter. He simply stared silently at the burned ruins with wet eyes. We saw the news, Harold said quietly. Leslie invited them inside the surviving section near the archive stairs. For hours they talked, and slowly decades of silence began breaking open. Harold described executives suddenly appearing during Whitmore's final years demanding impossible production cuts. Frank remembered equipment disappearing overnight before bankruptcy announcements were public. Walter finally spoke only once. They told us Margaret Whitmore lost her mind. His voice cracked. But she kept saying somebody was stealing the mill while we were still standing inside it. Leslie felt chills move across her skin. The same tactic repeated again and again. Powerful people labeling determined women unstable whenever they refused surrender. By evening, Rebecca organized testimony transcripts while Samuel copied surviving records digitally. The archive transformed into something larger than hidden history now. It became evidence, and word continued spreading. A Pittsburgh investigative journalist contacted Leslie requesting interviews. Labor rights groups began asking questions online. Even former Harper textile workers reached out quietly after hearing Leslie's story. One message simply read, "They threw us away too." For the first time since losing her job, Leslie realized something extraordinary. She was not alone. Millions of people carried similar wounds quietly through America. Discarded workers, forgotten towns, older people treated like expired machinery once profit margins shifted elsewhere. Whitmore Mill represented all of them now. Late that night, Leslie stepped outside alone. Snow drifted softly across the ruined property under pale moonlight. Half the mill remained destroyed, but the surviving section still stood stubbornly against the darkness, much like her. Footsteps approached behind her. Rebecca wrapped a blanket around Leslie's shoulders gently. You should sleep. Leslie smiled faintly. So should you. Rebecca hesitated. Then softly, almost painfully, she said, I'm sorry. Leslie looked at her daughter quietly, for what Rebecca's eyes filled instantly, for believing you were the failure. The words nearly broke Leslie apart, because underneath all their years of conflict lived one terrible misunderstanding. Rebecca thought poverty meant weakness. Leslie thought sacrifice alone could protect the people she loved. Both were wrong. Tears slipped silently down Leslie's face. Rebecca hugged her carefully for the first time in years. And standing there beside the burned ruins of Whitmore Mill, Leslie understood something powerful. The fire was supposed to erase her story. Instead, it forced the truth into the light. Spring arrived slowly in Belcrest. Snow melted from the hillsides in uneven patches, while muddy water rushed beside the ruined Whitmore Mill. Burn marks still scarred the western wing like open wounds, but life had begun returning to the property anyway. Construction trucks replaced fire engines. The sound of hammers replaced silence. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, people entered Whitmore Mill not to tear it apart, but to rebuild it. Leslie Cook stood near the front entrance one cold morning, watching volunteers unload reclaimed lumber donated from nearby farms. She still struggled believing any of it was real. 3 months earlier, she had been sleeping alone inside a condemned building while strangers mocked her online. Now journalists drove into Belcrest almost weekly. Labor unions offered support. Former textile workers volunteered expertise. A regional manufacturing grant helped stabilize part of the surviving structure after investigators officially ruled the fire suspicious. And perhaps most shocking of all, people finally stopped looking through Leslie as if she were invisible. Samuel Bennett approached carrying blueprints beneath one arm. You're staring again. Leslie smiled faintly. I keep expecting someone to wake me up. Samuel glanced toward the workers rebuilding support beams inside the eastern wing. Well, if this is a dream, it's a loud one. Leslie laughed softly. That sound still surprised her sometimes. For years, survival had swallowed joy before it could fully form. Now hope existed in small, unexpected moments. Coffee shared beside construction plans. Rebecca arguing passionately with grant coordinators over worker ownership structures. Older volunteers teaching younger apprentices how old weaving systems functioned. Whitmore Mill was no longer simply a building. It was becoming a movement, and that terrified Richard Coleman. 2 weeks after the fire investigation became public, Coleman Industrial Holdings stock began falling sharply. Journalists uncovered historical lawsuits tied to predatory acquisitions during the late 80s. Former workers from other closed factories came forward with stories eerily similar to Whitmore's collapse. Then Rebecca found the final piece, a hidden transfer agreement buried inside archived banking documents. The paper proved Coleman executives knowingly manipulated Whitmore textile debts shortly before bankruptcy, while secretly preparing to absorb its patents through shell companies. Fraud, intentional, documented. When Rebecca showed Leslie the evidence, neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Rebecca whispered, "This destroys them." No, Leslie realized quietly. The truth destroyed them. The same truth they spent decades trying to bury. 3 days later, Richard Coleman resigned publicly from Coleman Industrial Holdings, pending legal investigation. Belcrest exploded with gossip. Some celebrated openly. Others acted shocked, though many privately admitted they had distrusted Coleman for years. Leslie felt no triumph watching the news conference. Only sadness. Because men like Richard always believed they were untouchable until consequences finally arrived. And by then, entire communities had already paid the price. One afternoon, while workers repaired roof supports inside the restored eastern wing, Harold Green approached Leslie slowly carrying an old lunch pail. The elderly former Whitmore supervisor looked emotional. "Found this in my attic," he said quietly. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Original Whitmore employees standing proudly beside textile machines during the 70s and 80s, company picnics, Christmas parties, families gathered outside the mill beneath banners reading, "Built in Belcrest." Leslie studied the faces silently. Ordinary people, tired people, good people, the kind history rarely remembers properly. Harold sat beside her carefully. "Margaret Whitmore used to say the mill wasn't made of brick," he murmured. She said it was made of hands. Leslie felt tears rise unexpectedly, because she finally understood what Margaret protected all those years. Not just a weaving process, dignity. The dignity of work done honestly. The dignity of communities built by ordinary people who mattered even if corporations decided otherwise. That evening, Rebecca stayed late helping Leslie organize cooperative ownership paperwork in the temporary office trailer near the construction site. Stacks of forms covered every surface. Worker agreements, grant applications, equipment orders. For the first time since Rebecca was a teenager, mother and daughter worked side by side peacefully. Eventually, Rebecca lowered her pen and looked at Leslie quietly. You know what's strange? What? Rebecca smiled weakly. You look younger now than you did 10 years ago. Leslie blinked. That's impossible. No. Rebecca shook her head softly. You used to look tired all the time, even when I was little. The words hurt gently because they were true. Leslie had spent most of her life carrying survival like a permanent weight across her shoulders. Always afraid, always exhausted, always sacrificing pieces of herself for stability that never fully arrived. Rebecca stared down at the paperwork. I blamed you for a long time. Leslie said nothing. I thought being poor meant you failed somehow. Rebecca's eyes filled slowly. But now I realize you were drowning while trying to keep everyone else alive. Silence settled softly between them. Then Leslie reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. We both survived the only way we knew how. Rebecca broke down crying quietly. This time, Leslie held her. Not as a tired provider, not as a guilty mother trying to compensate for missed years. Simply as a woman who finally understood her daughter's pain too. Outside construction lights illuminated Whitmore Mill against the dark Pennsylvania sky. And for the first time in decades, the building no longer looked haunted. It looked alive. The reopening ceremony happened 6 months later. Nearly the entire town attended. People who once mocked Leslie now stood beside former mill workers applauding while local musicians played beneath banners stretched across the restored entrance. Whitmore Cooperative, mill rebuilt with pride. Leslie stood near the podium wearing a simple navy coat Rebecca helped her choose. She hated public speaking, always had. But as she looked across the crowd, something inside her settled calmly. Samuel stood nearby, smiling quietly. Harold Green wiped tears openly beside several former employees. Young apprentices moved through the restored production floor behind them, learning machinery once nearly erased forever. And Rebecca stood in the front row looking proud. Not embarrassed. Proud. The mayor finished his introduction and stepped aside. Applause echoed through the mill. Leslie approached the microphone slowly. For one terrifying moment, she forgot every prepared sentence. Then she looked around the room. At the restored beams, the repaired machines, the workers, the families. And suddenly she understood exactly what needed saying. When I lost my job, Leslie began softly, I thought my life was over. Silence filled the mill instantly. I believed what the world tells people once they get older. Her voice trembled slightly. That we become less useful, less valuable, easier to replace. Several older workers lowered their heads quietly. Leslie continued. But this mill taught me something different. She looked toward the rebuilt weaving machines behind her. Things built with dignity can survive almost anything. Tears filled her eyes now. The people standing in this room were never disposable. She swallowed hard. They were abandoned. The crowd erupted into applause, long, emotional, real, and standing there beneath the restored roof of Whitmore Mill. Leslie Cook finally felt something she had not experienced in years. Not survival. Not resistance, peace. Because after a lifetime of being told her value depended on productivity, youth, and obedience, she had rebuilt something powerful enough to prove otherwise. 5 years later, people drove to Belcrest from across the country just to see the mill. Tour buses lined the small rural roads during autumn festivals. Magazine reporters photographed the restored brick exterior glowing beneath strings of warm lights. University students visited to study Whitmore Cooperative Mill as a model for ethical manufacturing and worker ownership. But Leslie Cook still parked her old pickup truck in the same spot every morning. Some habits never left her. At 70, Leslie moved slower now. Her hands still ached during cold weather. Arthritis curled her fingers tighter every year. Long staircases exhausted her knees, yet somehow she had never felt stronger. Inside the restored production floor, weaving machines hummed steadily beneath tall industrial windows. Younger workers moved beside older mentors, learning techniques most corporations abandoned decades earlier in pursuit of speed and cheap labor. Whitmore fabric had become nationally known for its durability and craftsmanship. But Leslie knew the fabric itself was not the real miracle. The people were. Near the eastern wing, Harold Green sat beside a group of apprentices, teaching them how to adjust thread tension by listening to machine rhythm instead of depending entirely on digital sensors. "Machines talk," Harold muttered gruffly. Most people just forgot how to listen. The young workers laughed warmly. Harold smiled now more than he had in years. Nearby, Rebecca managed cooperative finances from a glass office overlooking the floor. She looked different, too. Lighter. Her marriage to Greg eventually collapsed under years of financial strain and emotional distance, but instead of destroying her, the ending forced Rebecca to rebuild herself honestly for the first time. She no longer chased corporate approval, no longer measured worth through exhaustion and fear. Like Leslie, she had finally learned survival alone was not living. Samuel Bennett still worked beside Leslie almost every day. Neither of them ever formally defined their relationship. At their age, labels mattered less than presence. He simply became part of her life, the way strong foundations become part of buildings quietly, steadily, permanently. Every morning, Samuel brought coffee. Every evening, he walked the property, checking repairs before locking up. And every once in a while, Leslie still caught him staring at her, the same way he had the day they first uncovered the hidden archive beneath the mill. Like he saw something valuable the world almost threw away. One October afternoon, a national television crew arrived for a feature interview. Leslie hated cameras. She always looked uncomfortable on television, too aware of her wrinkles, her tired hands, her plainness. But the producers insisted audiences connected with her because she looked real. That word always made Leslie laugh privately. Real. As if ordinary people had become unusual somehow. The interview took place inside the restored weaving hall beneath a massive photograph of the original Whitmore workers from 1978. Margaret Whitmore's portrait now hung nearby too. Not forgotten anymore. The young reporter smiled politely while cameras adjusted lighting. "Mrs. Cook," he began, "millions of people have followed your story over the past several years. But many still wonder." He paused dramatically. "What made you risk everything for an abandoned building everyone else had given up on?" The room grew quiet. Workers nearby slowed, respectfully listening. Leslie looked around the mill before answering. At the restored beams overhead, the humming machines, the workers laughing together near the loading dock, the life inside the building. Then she looked down at her hands. Hands. Harper Textile, once considered too old to matter. "I think," Leslie began softly, "people misunderstand what gets lost when places like this disappear." The reporter nodded carefully. "Meaning jobs?" "No." Leslie shook her head gently. "Dignity." Silence settled instantly. "When factories close," she continued, "people talk about economics, supply chains, corporate strategy." Her voice remained calm but firm, but they rarely talk about what happens to the human beings left behind. Several older workers nearby lowered their eyes quietly. Leslie continued, "I spent most of my life believing hard work guaranteed security. Then one day I was 65 years old, standing in a parking lot, holding a cardboard box, while people half my age explained why I no longer mattered." The reporter shifted uncomfortably. But Leslie kept going. And the worst part wasn't losing the job. She swallowed softly. It was realizing how quickly society teaches older people to disappear quietly afterward. Tears filled Rebecca's eyes across the room. Leslie glanced toward Margaret Whitmore's portrait. "This mill saved me because it reminded me something powerful." She smiled faintly. "Broken things are not worthless." The room fell completely silent now. Sometimes, Leslie whispered, they simply need someone willing to believe they can still become something beautiful. Even the camera crew looked emotional. The interview aired nationally 2 weeks later. Millions watched it. Letters poured into Whitmore Mill afterward from across America. Former factory workers, retired nurses, widowers, single mothers, people discarded by industries they spent entire lives serving. One letter from a 78-year-old coal miner simply read, You made me feel visible again. Leslie kept that one in her office drawer, not because it praised her, because it explained why Whitmore mattered. The mill had become proof that forgotten people still carried enormous value. That experience still mattered. That aging was not failure. Late one evening, after the cameras and visitors disappeared, Leslie walked alone through the quiet production floor. Golden light reflected softly across restored machinery while autumn rain tapped gently against tall windows. She stopped near the original support beam where she first discovered the carved symbol years earlier beneath dust and collapse. Someone had preserved it during reconstruction. The circle woven with thread patterns remained carved deeply into the wood. A reminder. Leslie touched the symbol gently. Then she looked around the mill one final time, at workers finishing evening shifts, at apprentices learning old techniques, at life returning fully to a place everyone once called cursed. And suddenly she remembered herself standing in the freezing Harper textile parking lot years earlier holding that cardboard box. Alone, discarded, terrified. Back then she thought losing everything marked the end of her story. But now she understood the truth. The world had not ended her life that day. It had stripped away the lie that her worth depended on being useful to people who never truly valued her. Whitmore Mill gave her something greater than success. It gave her herself back. Outside, rain fell softly across Bellcrest while warm light glowed from the restored windows of the mill beside the river. A building once abandoned, a woman once forgotten, both alive again. And somewhere deep within the steady rhythm of the weaving machines, Leslie Cook could almost hear Margaret Whitmore whispering across time. They tried to bury us, but they forgot. Seeds grow underground.